Hello, world history, and welcome to part one of our lecture on the French Revolution and Napoleon. So we have finished now talking about the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. And shortly after the American revolution breaks out in France. Really the birthplace of the Enlightenment movement, the Age of Reason. So we're going to be taking a look at this. Just to start with here, we have a painting by a man by the name of Paul Delaroche called The Conquerors of the Bastille before the Hotel de Ville. And this is a painting of an event that happened on July 14, 1789. After a day-long hunting expedition on that day, King Louis XVI returned to his palace in Versailles. Hours earlier, armed Parisians, that is, people of Paris, had attacked the Bastille. They had cut the chains of the prison drawbridge, crushing a member of the crowd, and poured into the courtyard. Chaos ensued. As shouts rang out, blood was spattered, and heads were paraded down the streets on spikes. They were pikes. When Louis heard the news, he exclaimed, "Then it's a revolt?" "No, sire," replied the Duke, bearing the news. "It's a revolution." The French Revolution had begun. And so, let us look at the French Revolution. What were the causes and effects of the French Revolution, and how did the revolution lead to the Napoleonic era? Camille Desmoulins was a French revolutionary leader and journalist who wrote pamphlets and journals to express his views on the revolution. He also spoke to Parisian crowds, and his stirring speeches in 1789 were a cause for the storming of the Bastille prison on July 14, 1789. This excerpt that I'm going to read is from one of his speeches, "Better to die than not live free." Quote, "In a democracy, though the people may be deceived, yet they at least love virtue. It is merit which they believe they put in power as substitutes for the rascals who are the very essence of monarchies. The vices, concealments, and crimes which are the diseases of republics are the very health and existence of monarchies." On April 28, 1789, just a few months before the storming of the Bastille, unrest exploded at a Paris wallpaper factory. A rumor had spread that the factory owner was planning to cut wages even though bread prices were soaring. Enraged workers vandalized the owner's home. Riots like these did not worry most nobles. They knew that France faced a severe economic crisis, but thought financial reforms would ease the problem. The nobles were wrong. The crisis went deeper than government finances. Reform would not be enough. By July, the hungry, unemployed, and poorly paid people of Paris had taken up arms. Their actions would push events further and faster than anyone could have foreseen. In 1789, France, like the rest of Europe, still clung to an outdated social system that had emerged in the Middle Ages. Under the Ancien Regime, or Old Order, everyone in France was divided into one of three social classes, or estates. The first estate was made up of the clergy, the second was made up of the nobility, and the third estate comprised the vast majority of the population. Approximately 95% of the French population made up the third estate, and everyone else that were not clergy or nobility was in the third estate, except for the royalty, the monarch. The monarch was technically above these three estates. During the Middle Ages, the Church had exerted great influence throughout Christian Europe. In 1789, the French clergy still enjoyed enormous wealth and privilege. The Church owned about 10% of the land, collected tithes, and paid no direct taxes to the state. High church leaders, such as bishops and abbots, were usually nobles who lived very well. Parish priests, however, often came from humble origins and might be as poor as their peasant congregations. The First Estate did provide some social services. Nuns, monks, and priests ran schools, hospitals, and orphanages. But during the Enlightenment, philosophers targeted the church for reform. They criticized the idleness of some clergy, the church's interference in politics, and its intolerance of dissent. In response, many clergy condemned the Enlightenment for undermining religion and moral order. The Second Estate was the titled nobility of French society. In the Middle Ages, noble knights had defended the land. In the 1600s, Richelieu and Louis XIV had crushed the nobles' military power, but had given them other rights under strict royal control. Those rights included top jobs in government, the army, the courts, and the church. At Versailles, ambitious nobles competed for royal appointments, while idle courtiers enjoyed endless entertainments. Many nobles, however, lived far from the center of power. Though they owned land, they received little financial income. As a result, they felt the pinch of trying to maintain their status in a period of rising prices. Many nobles hated absolutism and resented the royal bureaucracy that employed middle-class men in positions that once had been reserved for them. They feared losing their traditional privileges, especially their freedom from paying taxes. The Third Estate was the most diverse social class. At the top sat the bourgeoisie, or middle class. The bourgeoisie included prosperous bankers, merchants, and manufacturers, as well as lawyers, doctors, journalists, and professionals. Professionals and professors, I should say. The bulk of the Third Estate, however, consisted of rural peasants. Some were prosperous landowners who hired laborers to work for them. Others were tenant farmers or day laborers. The poorest members of the Third Estate were urban workers. They included apprentices, journeymen, and others who worked in industries such as printing or cloth making. Many women and men earned a meager living as servants, stable hands, construction workers, or street sellers of everything from food to pots and pans. A large number of the urban poor were unemployed. To survive, some turned to begging or crime. From rich to poor, members of the Third Estate resented the privileges enjoyed by their social, quote, betters. Wealthy bourgeoisie families in the Third Estate could buy political office and even titles, but the best jobs were still reserved for nobles. Urban workers earned miserable wages. Even the smallest rise in the price of bread, their main food, brought the threat of greater hunger or even starvation. Because of traditional privileges, the First and Second Estates paid almost no taxes. Peasants were burdened by taxes on everything from land to soap to salt. Though they were technically free, many owed fees and services that dated back to medieval times, such as the corvée, which was unpaid labor to repair roads and bridges. Peasants were also incensed when nobles, hurt by rising prices, tried to reimpose old manor dues. In town halls and cities, Enlightenment ideas led people to question the inequalities of the old regime. Why, people demanded, should the first two estates have such great privileges at the expense of the majority? Throughout France, the Third Estate called for the privileged classes to pay their share. And here we have a cartoon from that period representing the Third Estate there, carrying on his back the First and Second Estate. You can see he's kind of a farmer there carrying a clergyman, the man without a hat, and a noble, the man with the hat and the funny clownish looking collar. Financial troubles. Economic woes in France added to the social unrest and heightened tensions. One of the causes of the economic troubles was a mushrooming financial crisis that was due in part to years of deficit spending. This occurs when a government spends more money than it takes in. Right? So deficit spending. The government was spending more money than it was actually bringing in. So it's going to run a deficit. Louis XIV had led France deeply in debt. The 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, which the French supported, strained the treasury even further. Costs generally had risen in the 1700s, and the lavish court soaked up millions. To bridge the gap between income and expenses, the government borrowed more and more money. By 1789, half of the government's income from taxes went to paying the interest on this enormous debt. Also, in the late 1780s, bad harvests sent food prices soaring and brought hunger to poor peasants and city dwellers. To solve the financial crisis, the government would have to increase taxes, reduce expenses, or both. However, the noble and clergy fiercely resisted any attempt to end their exemption from taxes. The heirs of Louis XIV were not the right men to solve the economic crisis that afflicted France. Louis XV, who ruled from 1715 to 1774, pursued pleasures before serious business and ran up more debts. Louis XVI was well-meaning, but weak and indecisive. He did, however, wisely choose Jacques Necker, a financial expert, as an advisor. Necker urged the king to reduce extravagant court spending, reform government, and abolish burdensome tariffs on internal trade. When Necker proposed taxing the first and second estates, however, the nobles and high clergy forced the king to dismiss him. As the crisis deepened, the pressure for reform mounted. The wealthy and powerful classes demanded, however, that the king summon the Estates General, the legislative body consisting of representatives of the three estates, before making any changes. A French king had not called the Estates General for 175 years, fearing that nobles would use it to recover the feudal powers they had lost under absolute rule. To reform-minded nobles, the Estates General seemed to offer a chance of carrying out changes that those who had come with the Glorious Revolution, like those that had come with the Glorious Revolution in England, a period of progressive reform in England which shifted power to Parliament and away from the monarchy. They hoped that they could bring the absolute monarch under the control of the nobles and guarantee their own privileges. As 1788 came to a close, France tottered on the verge of bankruptcy. Bread riots were spreading, and nobles, fearful of taxes, were denouncing royal tyranny. A baffled Louis XVI finally summoned the Estates General to meet at Versailles the following year. In preparation, Louis had the three estates prepare cahiers, or notebooks, listing their grievances. Many cahiers called for reforms such as fairer taxes, freedom of the press, or regular meetings of the Estates General. In one town, shoemakers denounced regulations that made leather so expensive they could not afford to make shoes. Servant girls in the city of Toulouse demanded the right to leave service when they wanted, and that after a girl has served her master for many years, she receive some reward for her service. The cahiers testified to boiling class resentments. One called tax collectors, quote, bloodsuckers of the nation who drank the tears of the unfortunate from goblets of gold, end quote. Another one of the cahiers demanded the courts of nobles condemned the courts of nobles as, quote, vampires pumping the last drop of blood from the people. Another complained that 20 million must live on half the wealth of France, while the clergy devour the other half. Delegates to the Estates General from the Third Estate were elected, though only propertied men could vote. Thus, the delegates were mostly lawyers, middle-class officials, and writers. They were familiar with the writings of Voltaire, Rousseau, and the other philosophes. They went to Versailles not only to solve the financial crisis, but also to insist on reform. The Estates General convened in May 1789. From the start, the delegates were deadlocked over the issue of voting. Traditionally, each estate had met and voted separately. Each group had one vote. Under this system, the first and second estates always outvoted the third estate. 2-1. This time, the third estate wanted all three estates to meet in a single body, with votes counted by head. After weeks of stalemate, delegates of the Third Estate took a daring step. In June 1789, claiming to represent the people of France, they declared themselves to be the National Assembly. A few days later, the National Assembly found its meeting hall locked and guarded. Fearing that the king planned to dismiss them, the delegates moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. As curious spectators looked on, the delegates took their famous tennis court oath, depicted in our illustration here. They swore never to separate and to meet wherever the circumstances might require until we have established a sound and just constitution. When reform-minded clergy and nobles joined the assembly, Louis XVI grudgingly accepted it. But royal troops gathered around Paris, and rumors spread that the king planned to dissolve the assembly. On July 14, 1789, the city of Paris seized the spotlight from the National Assembly meeting in Versailles. The streets buzzed with rumors of royal troops who were going to occupy the capital. More than 800 Parisians assembled outside the Bastille, a grim medieval fortress used as a prison for political and other prisoners. The crowd demanded weapons and gunpowder believed to be stored there. The commander of the Bastille refused to open the gates and opened fire on the crowd. In the battle that followed, many people were killed. Finally, the enraged mob broke through the defenses. They killed the commander and 5 guards and released the handful of prisoners who were being held there but found no weapons. The Bastille was a symbol to the people of France, representing years of abuse by the monarchy. The storming and subsequent fall of the Bastille was a wake-up call to Louis XVI. Unlike any other riot or short-lived protest, this event posed a challenge to the sheer existence of the regime. Since 1880, the French have celebrated Bastille Day annually as their National Independence Day. The French Revolution unfolds. Excitement, wonder, and fear engulfed France as the revolution unfolded at home and spread abroad. Historians usually divide this revolutionary era into different periods or phases of the French Revolution. The moderate phase of the revolution is dominated by the National Assembly and lasted from about 1789 to 1791, and this turned France into a constitutional monarchy. That was followed by a more radical phase, 1792 to 1794, of escalating violence that led to the end of the monarchy and a reign of terror. After that followed a period of reaction against extremism, known as the Directory, and that lasted from about 1795 to 1799. And then finally the Age of Napoleon, 1799 to 1815. And the Age of Napoleon consolidated many revolutionary changes. So our next little bit of this lecture is going to cover that moderate period, the period of the National Assembly, and the moderate period. But we will see in this moderate period that as we move through this moderate period, the violence increases, and extremism increases until we get to what historians generally view as the radical period or extreme period. Here we have one of those events that was fairly extreme. This is a mob of women marching on Versailles, angry at the monarchy and in particular the queen, Austrian-born, right? So a foreigner, Austrian-born Queen Marie Antoinette. And they march on the palace at Versailles looking for the royal family, and in particular Marie Antoinette. And they chanted as they were marching through the palace and to the palace that they wanted to kill her. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but this is how the revolution unfolds once that National Assembly is declared at the tennis court. The political crisis of 1789, right, with the creation of the National Assembly, coincided with the worst famine in memory. So we have kind of a natural environmental event, this famine, and then we have this political and social event, these ideas and this reaction to a repressive and regime coupled with a collapsing economy. Starving peasants roamed the countryside or flocked to towns where they swelled the ranks of the unemployed. As grain prices soared, even people with jobs had to spend as much as 80% of their income on bread. 80% of your income on bread. Right? If you think about what that means, right? If you are still working, or when you were working, if you paid 80% of that on basic food, not eating out at fancy restaurants, just basic food, that's what this would look like. So again, if you made, for instance, $100 a month, you would have to spend $80 on just basic food items, leaving you only $20 to do everything else, pay your rent, pay your mortgage, buy gas, whatever else there is to do. In such desperate times, rumors ran wild and set off what was later called the Great Fear. Tales of attacks on villages and towns spread panic. Other rumors asserted that government troops were seizing peasant crops, and thus the shortage and famine. Inflamed by famine and fear, peasants unleashed their fury on nobles who were trying to reimpose medieval dues. Defiant peasants set fire to old manor records and stole grain from storehouses. The attacks died down after a period of time, but they clearly demonstrated peasant anger with the unjust regime. Paris, too, was in turmoil, so this great fear takes place in the countryside. In Paris, the capital city, right, and largest city, there was turmoil as well. As the capital and chief city of France, it was the revolutionary center. A variety of factions, or dissenting groups of people, competed to gain power. Moderates looked to the Marquis de Lafayette, the aristocrat hero of the two worlds who fought alongside George Washington in the American Revolution. Lafayette headed the National Guard, a largely middle-class militia organized in response to the arrival of royal troops in Paris. The Guard was the first group to don the tricolor, a red, white, and blue badge that was eventually adopted as the national flag of France. And here we see a picture of the Marquis de Lafayette. A more radical group, the Paris Commune, replaced the royalist government of the city. It could mobilize whole neighborhoods for protests or violent action to further the revolution. Newspapers and political clubs, many even more radical than the Commune, blossomed everywhere. Some demanded an end to the monarchy and spread scandalous stories about the royal family and members of the court. Peasant uprisings and the storming of the Bastille stampeded the National Assembly into action. On August 4, so about a month after the storming of the Bastille, in a combative all-night meeting, nobles in the National Assembly voted to end their own privileges. They argued to give up their old manorial dues, exclusive hunting rights, special legal status, and exemption from taxes. I believe I said argued. They agreed to give those up. So the nobles agreed on August 4 to give up old manorial dues, exclusive hunting rights, special legal status, and exemption from taxes. Feudalism is abolished, announced the proud and weary delegates at 2 a.m. As the president of the assembly later observed, we may view this moment as the dawn of a new revolution, when all the burdens weighing on the people were abolished and France was truly reborn. Were nobles sacrificing much with their votes on the night of August 4? Well, both contemporary observers and modern historians note that the nobles gave up nothing that they had not already lost. Remember, these had been stripped from them by Louis XIV. Nevertheless, in the months ahead, the National Assembly turned the reforms of August 4 into laws, meeting a key Enlightenment goal: the equality of all male citizens before the law. In other words, the law applies to everyone. Whereas under the Estates General, right, there were different laws depending on what estate you were part of. In late August, As a first step toward writing a constitution, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The document was modeled in part on the American Declaration of Independence, written just 13 years earlier. All men, the French Declaration announced, were born and remained free and equal in rights. They enjoyed natural rights to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Like the writings of Locke and the philosophes, the Constitution insisted that governments exist to protect the natural rights of citizens. The Declaration further proclaimed that all male citizens were equal before the law. Every Frenchman had an equal right to hold public office, with no distinction other than that of their virtues and talents. In addition, the Declaration asserted freedom of religion and called for taxes to be levied according to ability to pay. Its principles were captured in the enduring slogan of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. Many women were disappointed that the Declaration of the Rights of Man, did not grant equal citizenship to them. In 1791, Olympe de Gouges, a journalist, demanded equal rights in her Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. Woman is born free, she proclaimed, and her rights are the same as those of man. Therefore, Gouges reasoned, all citizens, be they men or women, being equal in the state's eyes, must be equally eligible for all public offices, positions, and jobs. Later in the Revolution, women met resistance for expressing their views in public, and many, including Gouges, were imprisoned and executed. The Declaration of the Rights of Man met resistance as well. Uncertain and hesitant, Louis XVI did not want to accept the reforms of the National Assembly. Nobles continued to enjoy gala banquets, while people were starving. By autumn, anger again turned to action. On October 5, about 6,000 women marched 13 miles in the pouring rain from Paris to Versailles. Bread, they shouted. They demanded to see the king. Much of the crowd's anger was directed at the Austrian-born Queen Marie Antoinette, daughter of Marie Theresa and brother of Joseph II, who we talked about in our last lecture. The queen lived a life of great pleasure and extravagance, and this led to further public unrest. Although compassionate to the poor, her small acts went largely unnoticed because her lifestyle overshadowed them. She was against reforms and bored with the French court. She often retreated to the Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the palace grounds at Versailles, where she lived her own life of amusement. And here we see the restoration of this little village that she would go to, where she would pretend, right? She would basically role play, pretend play as if she were a child. She would play milkmaid and shepherdess and herd sheep, right? And this was her little playground that she had, and we see that picture here. She also had her own portraitess, a female friend of hers, and had her paint a lot of portraits of herself. She was also a fashion setter in Europe. And this, of course, did not play well to the now starving, hungry, poor women who have been emboldened by the storming of the Bastille and these other actions that have been taking place, such as, at least in their minds, what had taken place in the Great Fear, which there really wasn't a lot that actually took place. But the stories were thick of action and violence of excuse me, peasants right, attacking nobility. When the women arrived at Versailles on October 5, they refused to leave until the king met their most important demand, that the king and the royal family return to Paris. Not too happy, the king agreed to do this. Next morning, the crowd, with the king and his family in tow, set for the city. At the head of the procession rode women perched on the barrels of seized guns. They told bewildered spectators that they were bringing Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their son back to Paris. "Now we won't have to go so far when we want to see our king," they sang. Crowds along the way cheered the king, who now wore the tricolor. In Paris, the royal family moved into the Tuileries Palace. For the next 3 years, Louis was a virtual prisoner in Paris. The National Assembly soon followed the king to Paris. Remember, they had been meeting in Versailles, in the tennis court that they had taken over in Versailles, near the Palace of Versailles, where King Louis XVI was residing. Its largely bourgeoisie members worked to draft a constitution and to solve the continuing financial crisis. To pay off the huge government debt, much of it owed to the bourgeoisie, the assembly voted to take over and sell church lands. In an even more radical move, the National Assembly put the French Catholic Church under state control. Under the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, issued in 1790, bishops and priests became elected, salaried officials. The Civil Constitution ended papal authority over the French Church and dissolved convents and monasteries. Reaction was swift and angry. Many bishops and priests refused to accept the Civil Constitution. The Pope condemned it. Large numbers of French peasants, who were conservative concerning religion, also rejected the changes. When the government punished clergy who refused to support the Civil Constitution, a huge gulf opened between revolutionaries in Paris and the peasantry in the provinces. The National Assembly completed its main task by producing a constitution. The Constitution of 1791 set up a limited monarchy in place of the absolute monarchy that had ruled France for centuries. A new legislative assembly had taken the power to make laws, collect taxes, and decide on issues of war and peace. Lawmakers would be elected by tax-paying male citizens over age 25. To make government more efficient, the Constitution replaced the old provinces with 83 departments of roughly equal size. It abolished the old provincial courts, and it reformed laws. To moderate reformers, the Constitution of 1791 seemed to complete the revolution. Reflecting Enlightenment goals, it ensured equality before the law for all male citizens and ended church interference in government. At the same time, it put power in the hands of men with the means and leisure to serve in government. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette and others had been urging the king to escape their humiliating situation. Louis finally gave in. One night in June 1791, a coach rolled north from Paris toward the border. Inside sat the king, disguised as a servant, the queen dressed as a governess, and the royal children. The attempted escape failed. In a town along the way, Louis's disguise was uncovered by someone who held up a piece of currency with the king's face on it. A company of soldiers escorted the royal family back to Paris, as onlooking crowds hurled insults at the king. To many, Louis's dash to the border showed that he was a traitor to the revolution. Radicals take over. So this is that shift, right, between the moderate National Assembly, which merges into the Legislative Assembly, and now we are going to enter into the radical phase of the revolution. Events in France stirred debate all over Europe. Supporters of the Enlightenment applauded the reforms of the National Assembly. They saw the French experiment as the dawn of a new age for justice and equality. European rulers and nobles, however, denounced the French Revolution. European rulers increased border patrols to stop the spread of the French plague, as it was called. Fueling those fears were the horror stories that were told by émigrés, that is, nobles, clergy, and others who had fled France and the revolutionary forces. Immigrants reported attacks on their privileges, their property, their religion, and even their lives. Even enlightened rulers turned against France. Catherine the Great of Russia burned Voltaire's letters and locked up her critics. Edmund Burke, a British writer and statesman who earlier had defended the American Revolution, bitterly condemned revolutionaries in Paris. He predicted all too accurately that the revolution would become more violent. Plots and assassinations, he wrote, will be anticipated by preventative murder and preventative confiscation. Burke warned, when ancient opinions and rules of life are taken away, we have no compass to govern us. The failed escape of Louis XVI brought further hostile rumblings from abroad. In August of 1791, the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Austria, who was Marie Antoinette's brother, issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. In this document, the two monarchs threatened to intervene to protect the French monarchy. The declaration may have been mostly a bluff, but revolutionaries in France took the threat seriously and prepared for war. The revolution was about to enter a new, more radical phase of change and conflict. In October 1791, the newly elected Legislative Assembly took office. Faced with crises at home and abroad, it survived for less than a year. Economic problems fed renewed turmoil. Assignats, the revolutionary currency, dropped in value, causing prices to rise rapidly. Uncertainty about prices led to hoarding and caused additional food shortages. In Paris and other cities, working-class men and women, called sans-culottes, pushed the revolution into more radical action. They were called sans-culottes, which means without breeches, because they wore long trousers instead of the fancy knee breeches that upperclassmen wore. If you need a translation, these are the trousers of the sans-culotte, and the knee breeches are the tights, right, that you might see the nobility wearing on a previous slide. Those tights that go about to the knee, and then the tall socks, etc. You guys know what I'm talking about. Right, these are, and these sans-culottes, these are like work clothes, right? These are seen as work clothes, and the people who wore these and came to prominence and during the French Revolution wore these with pride at one point, because this revolution is for, right, the common man, the worker. By 1791, many sans-culottes demanded a republic, a government ruled by elected representatives instead of a monarchy. Within the Legislative Assembly, several hostile factions competed for power. The sans-culottes found support among radicals in the Legislative Assembly, especially the Jacobins. A revolutionary political group, the Jacobins were mostly middle-class lawyers or intellectuals. They used pamphleteers and sympathetic newspaper editors to advance the Republican cause. Opposing the radicals were moderate reformers and political officials who wanted no more reforms at all. The radicals soon held the upper hand in the Legislative Assembly. In April of 1792, the war of words between French revolutionaries and European monarchs moved onto the battlefield. Eager to spread the revolution and destroy tyranny abroad, the Legislative Assembly declared war first on Austria and then on Prussia, Britain, and other states. The great powers expected to win an easy victory against France, a land divided by revolution. In fact, however, the fighting that began in 1792 lasted on and off until 1815. And that ends part one of this lecture on the French Revolution. And so we have just started, right, entering the radical phase. Part two will cover the radical rule of the French Revolution, or the radical phase of the French Revolution, beginning with the monarchy being abolished, and then we will move into the Napoleonic era. Right, so we will see you next time.